So the title for my class today, as was advertised, was What Would Rav Aharon Think About During Neila, which I thought would be interesting, maybe slightly provocative title. You know, who on earth is this guy, Joe Wolfson, to say he knows what Rav Aharon was thinking about during Neila? Somebody actually asked me just now in the corridor, said, did you ask him what he was thinking about? Chas v'shalom that I should ever have the temerity or chutzpah to have said to Rav Aharon, tell me what you're thinking about. However, I can have a pretty good sense of what Rav Aharon was thinking about during Neila for the simple reason that this wonderful book came out a couple of weeks ago. It's for sale just downstairs, and within the book's chapters there is one called Neila Teshuva, which is a really remarkable, beautiful piece in which Rav Aharon describes quite clearly, not obviously his own personal details in life, but what he thinks Neila is about and where he would put his kavanot during it. It so happened that I have to thank my friend and colleague Noam Shalit, who is the power behind a lot of what takes place in Yeshivat Ha'retzion for these sorts of days and digitally. It was his suggestion. It linked up with an idea that has been something which I've been interested in for quite a long time, and I've thought about a lot. I've never actually taught it, and it seemed to be a good opportunity to run the two together. So what we're going to do today is I kind of want to share the basic idea in this piece by Rav Aharon at the same time as adding a number of my own reflections. A number of the sources on the Daf Makorot are from here. A good number of them are my own additions as well. So if you see on the source sheet, the title is slightly different from, or rather there's an additional title to the one which was advertised. I've called it the Teshuva of Yom Kippur and the Teshuva of life, and with that as a subtitle, what would Rav Aharon think about during Neila? To sort of give a little bit of a sense of where we're going to go. We're, in a sense, going to sort of try and tease out what Neila is about, what it isn't about, and with that develop a perhaps slightly different concept of the sorts of teshuva that we're thinking about. So let's begin. There is a well-known Gemara in Masechet Avodah Zarah, the story of Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya, which we won't go into now. I assume people are familiar with it. He is a fascinating individual who travels the world seeking his pleasure and gratification. One day, visiting a prostitute far over the seas, she says a line along the lines of, "You are as far gone as they can. You have zero chance of ever returning. You are cast off. We can be sure will never do teshuva." And this leads to a crisis for Elazar ben Dordaya. And I cut out most of the Gemara because it's quite long. He runs to the rivers, he runs to the mountains, runs to the stars, pleads with all of these forces of nature to work on his behalf, to beseech, plead for mercy for him. They all say, we can't do it, we're thinking about ourselves. Eventually he has this moment, this is in the first line, Ein hadavar talui ela bi, it is only up to me, I am the only one who will be able to have any effect on my situation, on my predicament. And he bends down, crouches down, puts his head between his knees, ga'a b'chiyai, he cries out, ad sheyatzta nishmato, until he dies, until his soul departs. Yatzta bat kol va'amra, a heavenly voice comes down and declares, Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya mezuman l'chaye olam haba. Elazar ben Dordaya is welcomed into the world to come. And it's this remarkable story, and there's lots to say about it, and you could spend the whole time on it. But what we have essentially is this model or this story of an individual who is so far gone, and just in one kind of moment, how much time elapses between him saying Ein hadavar talui ela bi and his passing away and the bat kol coming out. How much time elapses, I don't know, but it is presented as very sudden. There is a mode of teshuva which allows a person to go from seemingly as far removed as possible to actually completely there in a single moment. And indeed, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi responds with his own bechi, saying, Yesh koneh olamo b'kama shanim, v'yesh koneh olamo b'sha achat. There are those for whom it's a lifetime's work. There are those for whom they get it in a single moment. This is Elazar ben Dordaya who gets it in a single moment. And I think many of us would probably think that it's a wonderful Agadata, it's an extreme story, it's not really, it's good for us to learn, maybe there's a message we can take from it, but it's not describing our own situation. Nevertheless, I want to suggest that actually in an attenuated form, there is a very popular common conception of Elazar ben Dordaya for everyone. Elazar ben Dordaya for every man. Here is an excerpt from Rabbeinu Bachya in Kada Kemach. Rav Amital would quote this very frequently in his words before Neila every year. We take the pasuk in Shir HaShirim. Kamti ani liftoach ledodi v'yadei nitfor mor. I arose to open the door to my beloved. And then Rabbeinu Bachya says it's a midrash. The truth is we don't have the midrash. The only source that we have for this is Rabbeinu Bachya. He now passes the verse. Kamti ani liftoach ledodi ze yotzer. V'yadei natfu mor ze musaf. V'etzbotai mor over ze mincha. Each part of the verse of Shir HaShirim refers to a different part of the day of Yom Kippur. Al kapot hamanul, upon the handles of the door lock, of the bolt, zu Neila. Neila is the door is closing. It is the last moment. It's about to be shut. Here is the moment in which we need to concentrate all our effort, all our kavanot, in order to get to that moment of Teshuva. And Rav Amital's drasha was one which I think is actually echoed in different forms by darshanim and rabbanim all over the world. The idea of Neila as the final opportunity. There's been a 10-day period, there's been a 40-day period, however you want to count it. This is the last moment that we all have. And I think there's something it doesn't need to be an exact parallel, but there's something of a continuation of the idea from Elazar ben Dordaya. The idea of En hadavar talui el abi, I push just hard enough, and I will make it. Of course, it's a double-edged sword. It's a major opportunity. It's the magic moment. But by the same token, the other side of the coin is that you might miss it, right? And if you miss it, then where are you left? And this is really Rav Aharon's jumping-off point. He quotes this, says that Rav Amital would do this, and he recognizes its significance. But then he says the following: Aleinu lahodot. We need to be honest, we need to admit, that this approach, shel teshuva k'mahapach pitomi, of teshuva as a sudden sort of revolution, a sudden turning around, shel harega aharon, of the last moment, eino holemet et hagisha hayehudit haklasit benogea teshuva. This is not the mainstream or the normative Jewish approach to teshuva. Hagisha hanotzrit hadominantit. It is actually a dominant approach within Christianity. Right? He mentions Paul on the road to Damascus, this idea that like the sky suddenly opens up and in a single moment Paul is transformed from being a persecutor of Christians to suddenly seeing what he thinks is the truth. That actually is the classic Christian approach. Just derech agav, I'll say as an aside, a number of years ago now, I had a fascinating and long conversation with a Church of England minister who I'd gotten to know a little bit, and we lived very close to each other, and I was beginning to think of my future and whether or not to commit to Rabbanut and religious leadership. And I thought, if I know this guy, I might as well, he's senior theologian in the Church of England, I might as well ask, spend some time with him and ask what he thinks. And I spent some time talking about why I was thinking about it and how it had been a very long process, and what I was thinking about. And it was fascinating. This was like a 3-hour conversation, and I remember many parts from it. One fascinating thing he said was, he says, I'm very happy to hear how you're describing your motivations. And I have to say they're very different from a lot of the young potential Christian ministers who I meet, who describe their desire to do it. Actually, they sort of lift from the Christian version of conversion and apply it to their own career things. They have this sort of like Paul on the road to Damascus moment. Suddenly something in their own lives, the sky opens up, and they decide to do this, which was fascinating insight. It wasn't how I thought about Rabbanut at all. And Rav Lichtenstein says this is not at all how the Jewish approach to Teshuva should be considered. Tfisa kazo, this approach, madgisha et hahebet hadati habenishi kaviyachol. It emphasizes the sort of religious aspect between an individual and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hayahadut le'umata rata b'tshuva b'rosh u'b'rishona. Judaism sees, first and foremost, tshuva as tahalich mitmashech, an ongoing process. Iti, it's slow. Hadragati, it's gradual. Hi hikira omnam b'tshuvat yom hamita. Yes, it does recognize there is Teshuva of the day of death. Yadashi yesh koneh alamo b'sha achat. Kerebi Elazar ben Dordai. Of course, this concept exists, as we've just shared. Gemara and Avodah Zarah. Maybe the implication of the Kada Kemach. Ach gishata habasisit shel hayahadut ro'a et yisod hatshuva k'ta'alich shel ma'amatz v'hitmodedut. The mainstream approach sees Teshuva as a process of effort, of sort of dealing with it, of struggle. Mitbaked behebet she'efshar liknoto musari. One could call it, more correctly perhaps, ethical. Klomar lav dafkan, and this is a line that I feel I need to think more about. I'm not completely sure exactly what he means by it. I'd appreciate any insights, but it's obviously important. Lav dafka b'ma'arechet hayachasim im HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not per se about the relationship between us and God. El b'tochnei hatshuva atzmam. Rather with the content of what Teshuva is itself. B'ma'avak im haro'a. The struggle with evil. Hen ben adam lachaveroa, hen ben adam lamakom. Whether we're talking about our relations to other people, our relations to God. Hahalacha higdira kama markivim yisodim b'tahalich zeh. Halacha has defined for us certain fundamentals within this process. Azivat hachet, charata al havar, kabbalah la'atid, vidui dvarim. Referencing, of course, the Rambam, beginning of Perek Bet of Hilchot Teshuva, when the Rambam says, Mahi Teshuva, what is Teshuva? And the Rambam says, you leave the sin. Azivat hachet. Charata al havar, you regret the past. Kabbalah la'atid, you make a determination for your future. Vidui dvarim, you acknowledge it, you verbalize it, confess. And here's the kicker. Ha'im b'shat dimdumei hachama b'rega'im ha'achronim shel Yom HaKippurim. Is it really possible, in the last moments of the day, as the sun is setting, yesh lanu orech neshima, we have the inner strength, l'tahalich yisodi me'ein zeh, for such a fundamental process as this? Lafachot lagabai hatshuva shlilit. It's always great when Rav Aharon gives them this. I don't know about the rest of you, but I can't do that. And of course, we're all left feeling, well, if you couldn't do that, Rav Aharon, then how on earth can we? Such a fundamental undertaking. Is that something which can be repeated can be achieved in half an hour? If you haven't done it until that moment, is it something which you can get in at the last moment? That's not for me, says Rav Aharon. That's not something I can do. And I love the sort of like the explicitness of it, the sort of the refreshing take on it, because I think the approach which he's critiquing is very much, even if we'll recognize it as it's not always the Jewish approach, it is what we do associate, I think, a lot with Neila. So I want to, at this point, I guess, divide into sort of separate between two strands which will follow. I think this excerpt from Rav Aharon leaves us with two different with two questions. First, to clarify, what is Teshuva? What is the Teshuva we're talking about? If we're not talking about Teshuva k'ma'apach pitomi as a sudden turnaround, but rather as a longer process, well, let's try and flesh that out. Let's try and think about that a little more. And the second one is, if Neila is not about achieving that last minute switch around, then what is Neila about? So those are two separate questions. What is this version of Teshuva? What is this version of Neila? I can say somewhat that the answer to the first question is the answer I want to give. That's less in the essay here. The answer of what is Neila about is more what Rav Aharon speaks about. But let's tackle Teshuva first. And Rav Aharon does indeed say this, does indeed begin to go down this line, as many have done before him. The Rav Aharon notes that when the Rambam, in his magnum opus of Mishnah Torah, decides to speak about human free will, obviously something fundamental to what will be the Rambam's whole tefisah, fundamental to our understanding of what it means to be human, where does he place it? He places it within Chiltot Teshuva, beginning of Perek Hey, Reshut lekol adam netuna. Each person has the choice. Im ratza lahatot atzmo lederech tova liyot tzadik reshut beyado. They wish to be good, they wish to take themselves down a righteous path, they can do that. Im ratza lahatot atzmo lederech ra'a liyot rasha reshut beyado. They want to take themselves down an evil path, they can do that as well. I always found this fascinating and not spoken about that much, and not really our topic for now, but love anybody's thoughts. The pasuk which he quotes for this, Hu shekatuv b'Torah, Hen Adam haya ke'echad mimenu ladat tov v'ra. Pasuk from Bereshit, from Gan Eden, from after eating from forbidden fruit, a pasuk which we wouldn't necessarily think of as a positive verse at all. We think of it as, this is the failure of Adam. Actually, this verse in the Rambam's use of it comes to define sort of the fundamental of what it means to be human. Klomar hen min zeh shel Adam haya yachid ba'olam. This species is unique. Ve'ein min sheni domeh lo b'zeh ha'inyan. We share much with the animal kingdom in many regards. This idea of a free moral will that each individual has, that is what is unique to our species. It's what defines us really as humans. And he goes on to say a couple of halachot later, v'devar zeh ikar gadol hu. Unsurprisingly, this is a fundamental pillar, hu amud haTorah v'hamitzvah. It would be impossible to conceive of Torah and mitzvot unless this idea was the case, and this idea was true. A lot of people speak about this. Why is this in Hilchot Teshuva? Rav Soloveitchik, in one of his Ala Teshuva lectures, divides Hilchot Teshuva from Perek Aleph to Perek Daled, which is Teshuva sort of without free will at the center, and then from Perek Hey to Perek Yud, which is Teshuva with free will at the center. It's a very interesting thing he does, but I think just, let's say, the simple approach, right? Rambam could have placed this halacha in all sorts of places. He chooses to put it in Teshuva because there is a direct link between Bechira Chofshit, between free will and the possibility of Teshuva. What is Teshuva is something we're still exploring, but it's tied directly to this ability to choose which path we want to take in our lives. And perhaps I'll go a step further now. If it's interesting that the Rambam places free will in Hilchot Teshuva, it's also interesting that the Rambam places Hilchot Teshuva in Sefer Madya, right? In the book which is the book of fundamentals. It's Yisodei HaTorah. It's Talmud Torah. It's setting the things before he can then get to the rest of Torah Sheba'al Peh. One could quite easily have thought that Hilchot Teshuva would be a section within Zmanim, right? It would be tied to Yom HaKippurim. The fact that the Rambam separates Teshuva from Yom Kippur and says this is a standalone idea, this is a fundamental that you need to know about, it begins to tell me that Teshuva is something we should try and separate as an idea and as a concept from being exclusively tied to Yom Kippur. Perhaps you can even push it a step further. The reading that we're going to do on Yom Kippur in the morning is Avodat Yom HaKippurim, Shnei Seirim, the two goats which have vidui said over them by the Kohen Gadol. One is They both have the lottery, the goral taken over them. Both represent the sins of Am Yisrael. One is sent out to the Midbar, La'azazel. One is raised up in the Mishkan or the Mikdash. Where does that chapter appear? Vayikra Tetzayin. We have lots of places where the Chagim are mentioned. The Chagim are mentioned in Mishpatim and in Ki Tisa. They are mentioned in Vayikra within Parshat Emor. They are mentioned in Pinchas. They are mentioned in Re'eh. Avodat Yom HaKippurim, as it is called, never appears in any of those sections. Rather, it is in splendid isolation. Vayikra chapter 16. We're going to have to wait another 7 chapters to get to Emor, right? And it does not introduce to us at the start as this is what you do on Yom Kippur. I think it's Pasuk Kaftet. You have to wait all the way until the end of the chapter 29, to be told, and by the way, this is what you do on Yom Kippur. I believe the Netziv and the Vilna Gaon on the Pasuk of Bezot Yavo Aharon. Aharon will do this. This is how he approaches the Kodesh. They both say, I believe he can do this at any time. Any time it needs to take place, it can take place. In other words, we shouldn't really, even though it's called commonly Avodat Yom HaKippurim, we would do much better to think of it as Avodat Teshuva, which of course takes place on Yom Kippur. But it's not fundamentally, exclusively tied to Yom Kippur. Teshuva is something which stands independent of Yom Kippur. Havei Omer, I would want to say, and using the Rambam's idea of free will, him placing of it there, that Teshuva, however we're going to understand it, is something fundamental about being human. Something which is so fundamental it can't be tied down to a specific day. Perhaps we could begin to approach a sort of a definition. It's about something to do with realizing our potential, deciding which path it is that we go down. And maybe just to put it in a bit of an exaggerated way, but hopefully it will make a point. On Purim, I think about Megillat Esther. I don't need to be thinking about Megillat Esther other times of the year. Maybe I will. It's lovely. It's wonderful. But Esther is tied to Purim. Nerot Chanukah are tied to Chanukah, right? There are points on the calendar which have specific ideas anchored to them. I feel it would be doing a great disservice to the idea of Teshuvah if you say Teshuvah is to Yom Kippur, as Esther is to Purim, as Nerot Chanukah are to Chanukah. Right? I hope that point makes sense. Even though we're being filmed, by the way, please feel free to weigh in and share thoughts. I feel this will be enriched by. I maybe should have said this earlier. Be enriched by making it something of a discussion. This is. I'm convinced of this. Let's try and push this a little bit further. Now, here I'm still sticking with Rav Aharon. I mean, I had similar thoughts before, but Rav Aharon does this as well. You can, in a sense, then see this as part of Neila. Right? This begins to get to a certain thing of Neila. Remember, by the way, our minhag is we do not say vidui, at least a personal one, within Neila. That is finished by the time we get to mincha. I don't know about you guys, but for me, that always comes as a little bit of a shock, right? You think you've still got time for it, and vidui is over in Neila. It's primarily about slichot. But Rav Aharon points out that what is at the heart of the text of the nusach, the following: Ma chayenu, what is our life? Ma chasdenu, ma tzidkenu, ma yeshuatenu. Right? By what do we deserve these things? What are our strengths? What are our redeeming factors? Ma gvurenu, ma nomar lefanecha Hashem Elokeinu ve'Elokei avotenu halo kil hagiborim ka'ein lefanecha v'anshei Hashem kolochamim. Everyone before you is as nothing. And then we quote Kohelet of all verses. Kohelet, one of the most depressing books in Tanakh, and one of the most depressing verses within that book. What is it that we say? Ma'asem tohu v'yemei chaim hevel lefanech mutar ha'adam min habehema ayin ki hakol havel. Right? What is our superiority over the animals? Right? This we place in Ne'ilah. And the Rambam's idea a moment ago that we are unique, that we are able to have a moral and an ethical will and choice. Is this the very same creature who is able to do this? And yet the nusach of the tefillah then turns it, right? Then moves from this sort of moment of despair to actually what God does see in humanity. Ata hivdalta enosh mirosh, Nevertheless, you set us apart. Takirehu la'amod lefanecha. You recognized us as being worthy of standing before you. Ki mi yomar lecha ma tifal. Who will tell you what it is you should do? And even if a person is good, ma yiten lach, what do you need from it? You have given us this day, Yom Kippur, as a chesed. And indeed, Teshuva or forgiveness is mentioned here. But that's not the focus. The focus is really, I mean, when I read these verses, I think when all of us do, these verses, or this text captures so beautifully, essentially we're asking, what is our worth? What is the nature of our humanity, right? You know, humanity is so frail, you know, so imperfect, and yet our potential, we are recognized. In other words, Neila is directing us to really sort of think about the essential nature of being human in a very, very powerful way. I want to sort of, from this point, share a couple of makorot, really one in particular that I think about a lot. Let's just sort of notice something sociologically. What does a Baal Teshuva mean? Okay, just think about that. What is the social usage of the phrase Baal Teshuva? And it's interesting that in the last, 50 years or so, it's come to mean something very specific, right? In fact, it's even got a kitzur, even in English, right? We don't really go in English so much for Rashi Tevot, but on this we do. It's a BT, right? Who is a BT? Someone who grew up secular, maybe from an assimilated family, found themselves at the Kotel on a Friday night, first time ever there, right? Maybe you know the song, and, has a process, is lucky enough to come into contact with a Shatara, with Or Sameach, with any number of the other Baal Teshuva movements. And what is a BT contrasted to? To an FFB, right? From birth, right? If you were lucky enough to grow up in an Orthodox, observant, halachic family, then you're not a Baal Teshuva. You're not a BT. You are a different category. I don't think any greater violence could be done to the idea of Teshuva than that reality. That's what the phrases mean. And even though we know it's not exactly that, nevertheless, it's become part of our language. Look at this Gemara. This is the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat. It's in the context of a conversation about why death and suffering comes to the world. According to Rav Ami, there is no such thing as random or maybe undeserved suffering. Ein milta belo chet. There is no death without sin. That's Rav Ami's position. And the Gemara asks on this. This is Meitveh. I'm jumping down to the second paragraph because this is the key. Quotes the following tradition. Arba meitu betio shel nachash. 4 died by the bite of the snake. What does that mean by the bite of the snake? Reference back to Gan Eden, Adam, Chava, the Nachash. They introduce death into the world. Death becomes shaveh l'chol Adam. Mortality becomes a reality, and it becomes a reality regardless of whether one sins or one doesn't sin. In other words, it's the opposite of Rav Ami's position. If you die by the bite of the snake, then that's not for any reason. It's just by dint of being in this world, and all of us are mortal. Now look at the following. Who are these 4 who died by the bite of the snake? In other words, people who died without any sin, any stain whatsoever, who led lives without any fault. Eluhen, Binyamin ben Yaakov, Amram avi Moshe, Yishai avi David, Chilav ben David. The 4 of them are Binyamin, Amram, Yishai, and Chilav. What do you notice about this list? What's surprising about this list? Who are these guys, right? Okay, from Binyamin, I guess we know their names. Although, by the way, Chilav is mentioned once in all of Tanakh, right? He has a single verse, and it's not even really a verse describing anything he's doing. It's just, we're told that he exists, right? These are the 4 people who led lives of perfection.
Also, very specifically mentions their father or their
Yafeh. Yafeh me'od. Right? Do I not know who Binyamin is? Do I not know who Amram is? In other words, it seems to be almost emphasizing the fact that it's not the others. What a strange Gemara. So look at this comment of Tosfot. Arba meitu beit Yoshin Nachash. Tosfot says, wait a second. Now we have a pasuk in Kohelet. Ki adam en sadik ba'aretz asher ya'aseh tov v'lo yecheta. There's no possibility of a righteous person on this earth who does good, but doesn't also sin. How can it be, therefore, that we've got these people? Kohelet says everybody sins. Tosfot's answer is, Barov b'nei adam ka'ama. Kohelet's talking about the majority of people. It's not talking about these four. I love Tosfot's question. I don't really like Tosfot's answer. And I think there's a much simpler and a much better answer than Tosfot's answer. The question is fantastic, right? Is it really possible to live a righteous life and not sin? And I think that the true answer is, forgive me if this comes out sounding a little bit extreme, but mod pashut. These are not the tzaddikim that Kohelet was talking about. In other words, if you want to live a life of being a tzaddik asher ya'aseh tov ba'aretz, what Kohelet is talking about, it is impossible to do that without also messing up. That is by nature. You could, in theory, live a completely righteous, perfect life, 100%, no mistakes ever made, like Chilav did, like Yishai did, like Binyamin did, but you'd never leave your bedroom. You would never achieve anything. You would never actually do anything in the world. And I think, sorry, pardon me, what's your name? Josh. I think it comes back exactly to your point. Do I not know that Binyamin is the son of Yaakov? Do I not know that Amram is the father of Moshe? I think the Gemara goes out of its way to emphasize not simply that these are people who are not at the forefront of our consciousness, but dafka, these are people who are very close to someone who is great, but they themselves are not that. In other words, the Gemara wants to emphasize Moshe, Yaakov, David. Could you say that they did tov in the world? 100%. Could you say that they didn't also have faults and mess up? You could not say that. In other words, going back to the point I was trying to make about what the phrase Bal Teshuva means, I would grant that perhaps there are four people in history about whom the phrase Bal Teshuva doesn't apply to. And I would say that they are Binyamin and Amram and Yishai and Chilav. In other words, there's no movement there. Nothing happens for them. But for everyone else, for every single other person who has existed, who does indeed, to go back to the Rambam in Perek of Hilchot Teshuva, have to actually think about which path we are going down and that ongoing struggle as to where we are heading and which path we take ourselves about, it applies to all of us. Right? And it's you know, that Gemara seems to me so sharp in saying, unless you are one of these four, and these four people, by the way, are not who we idealize. They are not who we are trying to be like. We are trying to be like the people who have achieved greatness, and with that greatness have also messed up, because that is the nature of being human. That is what happens to come to it. Yes, please. Yeah, fair. No. Yeah, fair me'od. I know. I'd never thought of that. Right, that might be what separates them. Yeah, fair. Yeah, very good. So just again, how is this linking into the broader argument I'm trying to make? If what I'd said, okay, just to recap. If our jumping off point is Rav Aharon's critique of the mainstreaming of the idea that during Neila we somehow are able to do a complete turnaround, and saying that that's not realistic and it's not the mainstream Jewish approach, and that therefore Teshuva is something which can't take place within half an hour, right? Yes, sure, for Elazar ben Dordaya, but that's not. I should have said this earlier. who are we really invoking here? We're not invoking Elazar ben Dordaya. We're invoking Rabbi. Right? Rabbi is the hero of that Gemara, according to this approach. Right? Bachar Rabbi va'amar yesh koneh olam b'shah achad v'yesh koneh olam b'kama shanim. And kama shanim means a lifetime. Right? Teshuva is the story of a lifetime. And Rabbi is not only Rabbi is really much more all of us. And it's Neila which actually does draw our attention to that. Neila which says, Ma enosh Adam, who is humanity that you think of us? Ma tidkenu, ma chasdenu. And yet you've given us this potential. And the Rambam sort of separates out Teshuva as something fundamental about being human. It's not in Zmanim, right? And it's got free will at its heart. And the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat tells us that with the exception of 4 people who are not our role models, every single person is someone who needs to be thinking about this to and fro. Every single one of us. I want to share a source now which is not a traditional one to appear on a Daf Makorot, or actually kind of is at Herzog, but not elsewhere. I never heard Rav Aharon mention it. I am almost 100% sure that he was familiar with it. Erich Auerbach was a great German Jewish scholar of literature. He fled Germany before the war, found himself essentially stuck in Istanbul. The legend is that in Istanbul there was not much of a great library of Western literature, but nevertheless during the war essentially wrote one of the most important works, one of the original works of literary criticism. It's a long book. It goes all the way up to Virginia Woolf, who he was a contemporary with. But it starts really as early as can be. And the first chapter, the subtitle is A History of the Representation of Reality in Western Literature. The first chapter is called Odysseus' Scar. And it's a contrast between what he sees as the 2 most ancient ways of telling a story in at least what has come down to the West. One is the ancient Greek, the Homeric legends, and the other is the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. And it's a great chapter. He compares the story of how Odysseus got his scar with the story of the Akedah. And we don't need to go now into the details. Essentially, he thinks these are 2 completely different ways of describing reality. The Greeks fill in absolutely every detail that can be filled in. How Odysseus got his scar is a flashback of many years, and you're told about the hunting trip he was on as an 11-year-old, and he was visiting his grandfather on such an island, and you're told about the party into the forest and what the shade looked like. You're given absolutely every detail. By contrast with the Akedah and Tanakh, in general, claims Auerbach, almost everything was withheld from you. It's a fascinating piece. It's a great piece. Then at the end, he says, he basically says, this isn't just a textual difference. Rather, these are 2 hashkafot olam. There is a fundamental difference between the characters of the Tanakh and the characters of the Homeric legends. It's quite a long quote I've put on it. I hope you'll agree with me. It is completely worth it. He doesn't once say the word teshuva or repentance. I don't think he needs to. I think this piece is worthy of real reflection and study. Here goes. Each of the great figures of the Hebrew Bible, from Adam to the prophets, embodies a moment of this vertical connection. God chose and formed these men to the end of embodying his essence and will. Yet choice and formation do not coincide, for the latter proceeds gradually, historically, during the earthly life of him upon whom the choice has fallen. Okay, I just remember that phrase to come back to at the end. Choice and formation. Okay, I think that's going to be key. How the process is accomplished. God has already chosen for us what we are going to be or what we can be. But the actual process of becoming that, how the process is accomplished, what terrible trials such a formation inflicts, can be seen from our story of Abraham's sacrifice. Herein lies the reason why the great figures of the Hebrew Bible are so much more fully developed, so much more fraught with their own biographical past, so much more distinct as individuals than are the Homeric heroes. Achilles and Odysseus are splendidly described in many well-ordered words. Epithets cling to them. Their emotions are constantly displayed in their words and deeds. But they have no development, and their life histories are clearly set forth once and for all. So little are the Homeric heroes presented as developing or having developed, that most of them, Nestor, Agamemnon, Achilles, appear to be of an age fixed from the very first. Odysseus, on his return, is exactly the same as he was when he left Ithaca 2 decades earlier. But what a road, what a fate lies between the Jacob who cheated his father out of his blessing and the old man whose favorite son has been torn to pieces by a wild beast, between David the harp player, persecuted by his lord's jealousy, and the old king surrounded by violent intrigues, whom Avishag Hashunami warmed in his bed, and he knew her not. The old man of whom we know how he has become what he is more of an individual than the young man. For it is only during the course of an eventful life that men are differentiated into full individuality. And it is this history of a personality which the Bible presents to us as the formation undergone by those whom God has chosen to be examples. And how much wider is the pendulum swing of their lives than that of the Homeric heroes? For they are the bearers of the divine will, and yet they are fallible, subject to misfortune and humiliation. And in the midst of misfortune and in their humiliation, their acts and words reveal the transcendent majesty of God. There is hardly one of them who does not, like Adam, undergo the deepest humiliation, and hardly one who is not deemed worthy of God's personal intervention and personal inspiration. Humiliation, and here's another line to underline, humiliation and elevation go far deeper and far higher than in Homer, and they belong basically together. Just as a point, I would almost say that Chilav and Amram and Binyamin, they're almost Homeric in this point, right? They are the ones who don't have this pendulum swing. Everyone else has the pendulum swing, humiliation and elevation. The poor beggar Odysseus is only masquerading, but Adam is really cast down, Jacob really a refugee, Joseph really in the pit, and then a slave to be bought and sold. The reader clearly feels how the extent of the pendulum swing is connected with the intensity of the personal history. Precisely the most extreme circumstances in which we are immeasurably forsaken and in despair, or immeasurably joyous and exalted, give us, if we survive them, a personal stamp which is recognized as the product of a rich existence, a rich development. Any thoughts on that source? Sublime, right? I mean, beautiful.
I think he kind of hints at Teshuva, even if he doesn't actually mention, where he says, I'll differentiate into full individuality. I read that as they're going through some metamorphosis, and that's Teshuva.
Yafeh me'od. Yafeh me'od. I mean, I agree. Remind me your name? Jared. Teshuva is like, hovering almost over every line here without being explicitly referenced. The development, what was the exact phrase? The differentiated into full individuality. When you're in a baby unit in a hospital and you see all those beautiful newborns, even as parents, they need to see, they have to have the wristband on them, right, in order to say which one they are. The person at the end of their life is so much more of an individual than the person earlier on in their life. The line which I really thought of almost as a deep and profound, I think, almost definition of Teshuva here is choice and formation. We don't know what God's choice is for us, but God has chosen something for us. And that exists from, I don't know, Arba'im Yom Lifnei Yetzirat Havlad. Who knows when it exists from? But the formation takes place over a lifetime. And I would want to suggest that sort of why this is so resonant for a discussion about Teshuva. Teshuva meaning free will of the Rambam, and Teshuva meaning ma enosh, ma chayenu, ma tzidkenu of Neila. And going back to Rav Aharon's thing that Teshuva is tahalich mitmashech, an ongoing process. Iti, hadragati, it's slow, it's gradual. My only problem with Rebbe's line, and I'll pretend he doesn't mean it literally, is Rebbe says it's kama shanim. But kama shanim not in the sense of 2 years or 3 years and 4 years. Kama shanim in the sense of, 60, 80, 120 years is what Rebbe is speaking about. Please, Josh.
I mean, it's a little off thing, but I can't help but wonder, and it ties into that whole idea of Christianity versus Judaism, of the priest is supposed to be perfect, not married, not have any, and in Judaism people have mistakes. And unfortunately, I think we live in a society now where when our leaders or whoever make mistakes, we use a Christian or Western mentality to treat them, and that's just not the Jewish way. Like, people make mistakes. I mean, obviously, when somebody hurts somebody, it's hard to balance, but we have like such a Western thought of how we approach people of mistakes, but that's really not the Jewish way.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And also just the phrase, like, the elevation and humiliation go together. That is like the anti, I think, chilav. Sorry to keep on coming back to these guys. Chilav and Yishai, right? If the pendulum swing is great, and we all, of course, Auerbach doesn't say this, but I think we can, and that's not just true for Adam and Yosef and Yaakov and David. It's true for all of us who read Tanakh and live a Jewish life and see this as the models to try and emulate. And so it's the opposite of the Elazar ben Dordaya. It's the opposite of the single moment. It's truly kama shanim. And that is what Teshuva is. How does Yom Kippur fit into that? That's a great question. We'd need more time to really explore it. I think we have to have an annual coming back to check in on where we are in the process. We can and should do it any time of the year. But Yom Kippur essentially in the calendar says, don't forget you are on this journey of choice to formation, of working out who you are. And it's a moment of us taking that very seriously. They're waymarks on the way. I'll just say very quickly, Derech Agav, a little hanhaga. I don't have that many hanhagot, but I think I got this from Rav Meidan originally. It's something that we've run in our communities. We do a Teshuva workshop every year, and something we suggest is taking a sheet of paper, and on one side of it writing down 3 or 5 things that you're working on, or you want to change, or you want to see improve. And then on the other side of the sheet, turning it over and writing down 3 or 5 things that you're pleased with and that you're happy with. And keep that. It's part of your tefillot. You have it with you on Yom Kippur. It helps anchor your kavanot. And it's great and it's beautiful. But the real power comes when you keep those slips of paper. And you keep them in your machzor. And you do this for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And you sort of get a chill. You're able to sort of like reference back. Here is where I was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. These were the things that I was working on. This is how is my journey going? Let's finish with Rav Aharon. So what does Neila mean then? What are we doing during Neila? Our focus is not on Teshuva per se. There's no vidui, as it were. Pachot ha-mesima shel shuvu midalkechem hara'im. It's less that. V'yoter shuvu elai v'ashuva alechem. More, it's God's chesed, His kindness, return to me and I will return to you. Lav dafka mitoch ma'apach ishi pitomi. Not necessarily out of a sudden reversal, a sudden revolution in ourselves. Ela bi'ikar mitoch pniya lemidat hachesed ha'eloki. Rather, out of a turning, asking for God's chesed in our lives. Shiachus aleinu v'shiyakabel otanu kamo sha'anu. To have mercy on us, accept us as we are. Od lifnei shehushlama mesimat teshuva. Before the process of teshuva has been completed. Here is the midrash that Rav Aharon summons. Ba'oto sha'a, at that moment, speaking about Moshe and Hashem, and Moshe showing Hashem His mercy. Oto sha'a herelo HaKadosh Baruch Hu et kol ha'atzrot shel matan schar. He showed him all of his treasure houses of reward. Shehen metukanim letzadikim. V'hu omer, Moshe would say, ha'otzer hazeh shel mihu, who gets this treasury? V'hu omer shel osei mitzvot, people who do mitzvot get this one. V'ha'otzer hazeh shel mihu, who gets this treasury? Shem legadlei yitomim, those who give kindness, who raise orphans. Moshe would ask about every single treasury of reward, and he would say, who is this for? And Hashem would tell him. And after that he saw a great one. Amar ha'otzar hazeh shel mihu, who does this belong to? Amar lo mi sheyesh lo, ani noten lo mischaro. Someone who has accrued much, I give him his reward. V'mi she'ein lo, and one who doesn't, ani yoseh lo chinam v'noten lo mizeh. This is my account. This is my free giving to someone who doesn't have it. Shene'emar v'chanoti et asher achon, v'chanoti et asher achon, למי שאני מבקש לכון, וכן ריחמתי את אשר ארחם. Says Rav Aharon, יש אוצרות של מתן שכר לאלו החוזרים בתשובה במשך חודש אלול. There is reward for those who return during Elul, בעשרת ימי תשובה, and during Yom Kippur, עד לתפילת נעילה. בנעילה אנו מתרפקים על הקדוש ברוך הוא כדלים ופרשים. But that's not what we do during Neila. We beseech God, we approach God as those who are unworthy. מבקשים שייתן לנו מאותו אוצר של מתנת חינם. Give to us, Hashem, from that free one, that one you've got reserved for people just as they are, in their lives, genuine where they are in their lives on that journey. ואתה ברחמך הרבים רחם עלינו, כי לא תחפץ בחשכת עולם. Have mercy on us, allow us to continue this journey from choice to formation. Bezrat Hashem, shtul bizochet, to have a meaningful Yom Kippur, and it's okay if it's not Elazar ben Dordaya, and it's better that we should have a Yom Kippur of growth and of process. Thank you very much, everyone. Shal koach.